House Committee on Environment and Energy. This afternoon, we're going to continue our discussion of H67, an act related to household products containing hazardous substances. And we have with us Paul Burns with VPIRG. Welcome back.
Thank you, Madam Chair and members of the committee. For the record, my name is Paul Burns. I'm the Executive Director of VPIRG, the Vermont Public Interest Research Group. We are, again, as a reminder, the largest consumer and environmental advocacy organization in the state, and we have a long history of engagement on a wide range of environmental issues, including issues in the area of waste and recycling, hazardous waste issues, all of which are kind of wrapped up in this question before you with H67. Let me say broadly, we strongly support the concept, idea, and approach that those who create messes should clean them up. This held true in kindergarten for me and for my child as much as possible. And it really has application in all sorts of environmental laws and programs that we can think of at the state and federal level, from collection programs for mercury light bulbs to the federal Superfund program for hazardous waste cleanup. And when you can identify a responsible party, it does make sense that that party bear the cost and responsibility for cleaning up, or even better, preventing environmental or public health threats. So conceptually, we think that that makes sense. In many ways, this is the thrust behind the idea of an extended producer responsibility approach to environmental legislation. The producer, the manufacturer of the product, has a responsibility to collect and ensure proper recycling or disposal of those products or packaging. That is a pretty clear thing. Bless you. It has often been used in areas where we're dealing with products or materials that are particularly dangerous to public health or the environment, that are toxic, for instance, or that might otherwise be littered in the environment. This was a strong incentive for EPR programs going back to the bottle bill, which was the first in this state that is an EPR program. Manufacturers bear responsibility for the proper collection and ultimately recycling of those materials, but also for things that VPIRG has had a significant hand in. And you heard mentioned, I know in earlier testimony, some of the other EPR programs in the state, like for electronics or mercury light bulbs, lamps, thermostats, for paint and batteries. Vermont really has been a leader in this area, and I think with good reason, because ultimately you're talking about two different reasons for backing this kind of legislation. One is to ensure or try to maximize the proper collection of this material that is potentially a threat to our environment and or public health. And that having a separate kind of program to collect that stuff can mean that you will simply get more of it. And having manufacturers involved in that process and taking responsibility for it means, too, that they are the ones paying for it, as opposed to consumers or taxpayers who are kind of left otherwise holding the bag for this material. But it is more than just EPR programs. I believe should be thought of as more than just a fundraising tool, because it really is important to have these programs in some way so that you're having the best shot at getting it back, at collecting it, not necessarily getting it back, but collecting it, preventing improper disposal, or even proper disposal. You don't want these things to just go to a landfill, because as you heard earlier, I think EPA has said all landfills leak. I mean, they do eventually leak. And so you want to put material in there that doesn't present a potential future threat to water supplies, to public health, to the environment. And so again, a program like the bottle bill, we know, has higher collection rates than other recycling programs for the very same materials. And programs like those that put an incentive on your mercury thermostat, you get, I think it was $5 back if you bring it back to the hardware store. That's a little bounty on that, just similar to a deposit on a can or bottle. That encourages consumers to do the right thing rather than perhaps the easy thing, to put it in their trash. but that's mercury going into the trash. And so again, as a public policy matter, we've decided, let's try to minimize the amount of mercury going into landfill. We may not prevent 100%, but with programs like that, putting a small bounty on it, an incentive for consumers to do the right thing, you maximize your opportunity to collect that stuff and prevent it from becoming an even bigger threat to the environment. So those are the at least two main benefits that I see: getting more of it, preventing as much as possible of these materials from being a danger to the public health of the environment, and two, that question of who's paying for it, and should it be the consumer, the taxpayer, or the manufacturer? We believe, in most cases, the manufacturer does make sense. Now, turning to the household hazardous waste legislation that you have before you, it fits the same bill. It isn't a particular product as these other examples have been in Vermont of electronics or batteries or paint, but we're talking about products that share a common trait, which is that they are hazardous. And therefore, by their very nature, not things that you want to be out into the environment. Certainly don't want them thrown over the side of the road, but nor do you simply want it hidden away in somebody's bag of trash. And so the state has, and local districts have had collection programs and done, important education programs and work. And I applaud their efforts to do what they can to try to educate consumers about the opportunity to do the right thing with those materials. But that it costs a lot of money. And again, I'm not the expert on that, but I know you heard testimony today about the high cost, which is getting much, much higher year over year as well to provide those same services and collection opportunities for people. So I think the question before you is there something that we rationally could do as a state to try to even expand on those programs, more public education, more opportunities for take back, and shifting the burden of who's paying for those programs, because otherwise some of them may cease to exist if we don't do something to try to raise additional dollars, I think. And again, that question comes, should it be the manufacturer or should taxpayers just foot an ever-growing bill associated with that kind of collection? We support the idea that manufacturers do have a responsibility in this case to pay for it. And I think the basic foundation or structure that you see in the legislation is reasonable. What would be required of the stewardship entity here to produce a plan to ensure that they're providing education, outreach, and collection in reasonable locations for people to utilize makes sense, and that they have to have a certain level of participation. I might go a little higher, but I didn't write this. I'm not the expert on it, but we always want to go a little more aggressive in terms of that kind of thing. But it's not unreasonable, I think, what you have in here now. So support for certainly the basic thrust of this legislation. I did hear most of the earlier testimony from DEC, which we agreed with most of that. I just noted that Matt Chapman had a couple of ideas that I thought I'd just note here. He was talking about the advisory committee, that it's not necessary, and that the agency would be willing to consult with the various named entities there. I wouldn't have an objection to that. We have a very good working relationship with Matt and the agency and those kinds of things, and I'm sure that our voice could be heard. Not that we would have been the environmental statewide group on this panel, but I don't need to be on another panel. And I think, most of us recognize that we would have a fair opportunity to participate in a process of creating those kind of plans. So I wouldn't object to that suggested edit. And the process for plan approval, again, using the existing structure for that type of thing, that as DEC suggested, we wouldn't object to that. I did hear the ski wax question come up. VPIRG did have played a significant role in trying to address PFAS in different products, the perfluorinated chemicals and toxins there, including in ski wax. Vermont was the first, and I think still the only state to prohibit the use of PFAS in ski wax. I think there's a lot of good reason for it, but for the very same reason that we don't want PFAS applied to the bottom of skis and out there in the environment, we also want to provide the best possible collection of that stuff. I'd have ski wax in here for that reason. And the last question about I'm sure there were others, wasn't able to see all the testimony. The propane gas tanks, the cylinders there, I think, as a broadly, I want to applaud the manufacturers in that case, because they are doing a pretty good job of reuse. That is the top priority there, is not recycling, but actual reuse of products wherever you can. And they are doing a pretty good job of that. I know that some folks who have spent more time on this than I have are looking at whether there would be any unintended consequences by simply eliminating those two words. That was the suggestion. So I think that's fair, and you should listen to the folks who are digging into that. But broadly considered, we wouldn't object to the idea that those could be exempt from that if it didn't have unintended consequences for other items that could be reused that I'm just not thinking of right now. But for those particular products, I think we do have a pretty good system in place, and it seems to be working pretty well, and that's fine. I think that's what I came to share with you today, Madam Chair. I'd be happy to answer any questions if there are any.
Thank you. Do members have questions? Representative Sibilia.
Madam Chair, I apologize if you took this up before I came in the room, and I apologize for being late. But there was a question around milk jugs and bleach. Did that?
We haven't covered that.
Okay. So we were talking about.
It's not a trick question either.
No, I'm not going to be able to.
The orphans.
Okay, the orphans definition. Yeah. I'm probably making this into a much bigger thing than it actually is. So the orphan definition, right? It seems a little unclear as to whether or not milk jugs with bleach are an orphan or are not. The orphans, we understood, were maybe old companies that no longer were in existence. So they're gone and their children exist, and those are orphans. Milk jug with bleach.
You actually mean, pardon me, Representative Betty, just a jug of bleach, not an actual former milk jug.
No, like a milk jug, or we also heard about peanut butter containers with paint thinner. So,
I see.
So
okay, now I'm getting it.
We consider those orphans or not. And I actually don't care either way, but I feel like the language was a little bit not clear enough. So do you have any strong feelings?
I would happily defer to a couple of people sitting behind me. I'm sorry. I would need to think about it. That's a fair question, and I don't know the answer immediately, Representative. I apologize.
Nope. Okay. Just a kind of opinion.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Other questions? Yes, Mr. Smith.
I guess.
Representative Smith.
Okay, thank you. It sounds to me like what you're saying is that you want to hold the companies responsible to pay, to foot the bill to clean up this stuff. Am I correct?
In this case, what we're really trying to do, it's less a hazardous waste site that we're trying to clean up, but rather to prevent environmental harm that might come if people don't do the right thing with this. And in this case, the right thing is not just putting it in your trash, so even on going to a landfill, even a lined landfill is not a good receptacle for this material ultimately. And so what I'm really saying is that they should bear responsibility for helping to provide education and opportunities for convenient collection for this material so that it's dealt with as soon as its useful life for that consumer has ended.
Okay, this may not be to the extreme that I'm thinking, but it almost sounds to me like it's close to the idea of if someone gets shot with a rifle, the manufacturer should be responsible. And maybe that's a little bit over the edge, but it's a little bit what it sounds like to me.
That's not an example that comes to mind for me that would be a close one to this. I think it really is. This is what has to happen to that product as a result of its being used as directed by the consumer, is that you ultimately need to dispose of this thing at the end. So quite different from a situation of shooting somebody intentionally or unintentionally in that way. This is a consumer product that is used as directed by the manufacturer. And really just the question is what happens to it at that point when the consumer is done with it, and who pays for it at that time. And I think it is readily, and we can anticipate that this will happen with really every single one of these products that is sold, cleaning products, pesticides, you name it. And we just have to decide as a public policy matter, what do we want to happen to that? And of course, I think I bet we all agree, we don't want it just tossed over the side of the road, and we really don't want it thrown into a landfill.
So the public's paying for it now.
The public is paying for it now in one way or another. You're either literally paying for it in taxes, or you might be paying for it in a deterioration or threats to the environment or even to public health or water supplies. I mean, all of these things cost a lot of money. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yes.
And it comes out in the leachate at the landfill.
Mhm.
All right, other questions? Thank you.
Thanks very much.
Thanks. Next, we have Aaron Segrist. Welcome.
Hi. Thanks for having me. Welcome back, everyone. Welcome to the newbies, the freshmen. My name is Erin Segrist. I am president of the Vermont Retail and Grocers Association. Just a quick little bit about VRGA. We have over 750 members around the state. Our members include general retailers, grocers, independent grocers, as well as like the larger grocers, convenience stores, distributors, food producers, and business service providers. Those could be the attorneys or insurance brokers. They're usually joined in order to participate in conversation with retailers. And of the retail and food retail related membership, our membership represents about 2,000 outlets in the state. We also administer the Vermont Specialty Food Association. And quick plug, February 9th, we have our legislative day in Vermont Specialty Food and Beverage Tasting at the Capitol Plaza. The specialty food and beverage tasting used to be here in the cafeteria. It was one of the most anticipated events because it's all delicious Vermont made products. So please join us. It's 4 to 6 p.m. February 9th across the street at the Capitol Plaza. So jump off the floor and come join us and have some delicious food. So thank you for having me come in today to talk about household hazardous waste. I'll keep it fairly brief. I think there are more questions related to age 67 than we have that we'll need answered before we can take a position. But essentially, a couple of the questions that come to mind are what type of products on store shelves are covered in this bill? We're concerned that we're talking about a broad spectrum of household hazardous waste, and we want to make sure we have a real understanding of what that list looks like. I know we can talk about motor oil or pesticides. I assume it's the cleaning supplies, but what else? What else are we looking at? And ultimately, what is the problem material? Are we looking at a narrow problem, a narrow scope of material that is causing the problem within the solid waste districts? We would love to understand more what the problem is, and what they're collecting most of now that is causing that issue. And as far as the retail role, we don't necessarily see where this bill will impact a retailer, in the sense that we don't have a role in collecting the products, which we are not asking for. We do not want to, retailers do not want to be redemption centers. So I think our biggest concern is the increased cost. The previous witness talked about manufacturers should be the ones that are responsible for covering this cost. But I think we all can realistically understand that increased costs on the manufacturer more than likely get passed on to consumers. So an additional extended producer responsibility fee will get passed on to consumers, which then brings up the question about how this impacts retail in general in the state. We have several customers who already crossed the border to go shopping in New Hampshire. So how will that impact retail's landscape here in Vermont? Will this push more people across the border to shop for these products? If they do cross the border and shop for these products and they bring them back, now you're talking about containers that have not been quote paid for, or manufacturers haven't paid the EPR into the EPR system if you've purchased the product out of state. So I think there's some logistics and I think just understanding what that system would look like. Also, I think we need to take a step back for those that are new to the State House. there has been discussion about an EPR program for all packaging for several years. We've had that discussion in this building. So I'm wondering what that would look like. If we're going to introduce an extended producer responsibility program for all packaging, would this be another parallel system that manufacturers are paying on top of? So if we have two parallel systems, are manufacturers paying twice? Are customers seeing that increase in price twice? So I think we need to look at the discussion or the system as a whole and identify where we're headed before we move forward with creating another EPR program specifically for household hazardous waste. I know that was a lot. I'm happy to answer questions, but I do think we have questions before we can dive deeper into that discussion.
Representative Stebbins.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I wonder if you've seen this. This was presented to us this morning by Mr. Kelly over there. It does address some of the questions that you raised, which are, good questions in terms of which waste products and also the types of companies. And I guess one of the things that I've heard, and if you have a different perspective, I'd love to hear it, but that if Vermont, that this has been done in like 3 provinces in Canada, but not yet in the US. And that like, it's unlikely that Sherwin-Williams or the Clorox company would change its price tag on a bottle of bleach or whatnot, or paint, because, 650,000 people in the state of Vermont have this program, that they set their prices more like globally. And I wonder, I think I would have more concern about what you're talking about in terms of the impact to retailers if it wasn't like, I can't imagine Colgate Palmolive like setting their price tag based off of the one state of Vermont putting this forward. But I wonder what your thoughts are on that.
So I'm aware that it wasn't introduced in other states. I'll be honest, I don't have much time to pay attention to Canada these days, but thank you for bringing that to my attention. I think that, it really depends on the situation. We can also say that manufacturers weren't going to change their labeling when this legislature passed GMO labeling, and products were pulled off of the shelves and no longer distributed to the state for a week. So it's a conversation you need to have with the manufacturers. If we're talking about access to products and empty shelves for retailers, then it becomes an issue. Is it a significant increase in pricing? Maybe not, but it's an increase in pricing. And we all know that when one state introduces legislation and passes legislation, it quite often pops up in several other states. So this, if this passes, it may become a trend in other states and you will see increased prices.
So we've taken a lot of testimony on the significant increase in the cost to our solid waste management districts of managing these hazardous substances. And I guess I'm curious if you have a funding source you would support to help cover the costs of addressing these chemicals at the end of their lives.
I do not have a funding source that I would support today.
Mm-hmm. Because that's a big problem. And it's been sort of out there in the conversation for a long time. And how do we pay for this?
That's understandable. That's a great question. But I think we also need to go back to what are the problem products, right? So, a customer buys a bottle of Windex and uses the bottle of Windex. Windex isn't the problem, right? So why are we putting an EPR program together for all of these, quote, household hazardous waste? So if we're having an issue with a very narrow scope of products. Additionally, I see pesticides is on this list. Pesticides, there is already a fee to sell pesticides in this state. So if we're looking at pesticides alone, there's a fee on top of a fee if we have a household hazardous waste program. So, I'm not we as retailers do not have a proposal to present this committee for how to pay for a household hazardous waste program. I think you need to look at it at the greater picture. If this legislature is going to pass an EPR program for all packaging, why would we have an EPR program for household hazardous waste? So I think it's a larger conversation.
I think we would have it because we've taken serious testimony that's the most toxic thing in the waste stream that needs to be separated out, separate from the packaging, which is also a burden. That's why we're considering.
So we would have multiple EPR systems running at the same time.
For different costs of the product. I was gonna go, oh, it's also, yeah, okay. Other members have questions? Representative Spelman.
Just a clarification. So what I'm making sure I understand this. So we're hearing, what I think you're saying is that the list of products that are here, you are saying that it's unclear to you that why they are a problem, or how it is discerned that they are a problem, or determined that they are a problem, or that they are on the list. Is that what you're saying?
So what are the problem products that are increasing the cost to the solid waste districts? You know, is it the camping gas canisters that we're talking about? Is it the Windex bottle? Is it unused product that we're talking about? Because not everybody is bringing back unused product.
So it's unquantified?
Yes.
So what you would want to know is the quantities of products, and what would that help in terms, having the quantities, how would that be helpful to, why should we want that? How would that be helpful to us?
I think because I guess I'm struggling to understand that the Clorox bottle and the Windex bottle, and how many Clorox bottles are returned with liquid in it? How many Windex bottles are returned with liquid in it? Are we talking about half-used containers, or are we talking about the container in general after it's been completely used and thrown in the blue bin?
Oh, it's different than what I thought you were saying. So you're talking about, is it the container or the product?
I think what's the
inside?
problem? What's the problem in general is what we need to understand. Why are these costs going up? And why is an empty bottle of Windex being handled differently than, I don't know. I would look to Jen to talk about how they handle a half-used bottle of Windex and a completely empty bottle of Windex, right? Is the half-used bottle the one that's causing the increased costs? Is it the empty bottle and the half-used bottle? Like, what is causing the cost to increase? Why are the costs increasing, and which one? We need a smaller scope of products that won't be impacted, is what I'm saying.
So I want to make sure I understand so I think you are saying that if we,
It's a complex situation. I guess I don't completely understand why we're looking at an EPR program for empty bottles.
But we're not. We actually took testimony on that this morning.
Okay, I'm sorry.
I covered the empty bottle question
Well,
earlier.
I cover several committees and
No, I'm not saying you should have been here at all. I'm just saying we did take
Okay.
testimony on that.
So the empty bottles are not the problem.
Right.
So why are we placing an extra fee on manufacturers for empty bottles?
We're not. So, and I guess, so I don't know if you've read the bill, but it's like it gives the manufacturers flexibility in establishing an EPR. They could set it up based on whatever metric they choose. So they are responsible for how they set it up, and that's been done with other EPRs. So it's about it could be about the volume of material returned. Maybe there is more of a certain type And they could set it up so that that cost was what was covered, but that's,
Okay.
Thank you, Madam
As,
Chair.
as far as the retailer is concerned, we have concern of increased cost on products. We also strongly, and it's not in the bill, I understand, but we do not want to be redemption centers for these products. So, right, but I just, for the record, want to make sure that, that retailers don't become redemption centers.
duly noted. Thank you. Other members, other questions? Yes, Representative Smith.
Thank you. So I'm a little confused. Actually, I'm a lot confused. Are we looking, have we been listening to having this all broken down at a hazardous waste dump? Of each individual manufacturer being responsible? Say, for example, Kingsford is on here, Benjamin Moore, Windex. Is when these products are collected, somebody going to send a bill to each one of these companies?
So you mentioned Benjamin Moore, they would be out. There's already a program for them.
Okay.
But the household hazardous wastes that are on the list and not already part of another PR program are directed to work together to establish a way of funding collection of unused portions of their hazardous products.
So, for example, a propane one we talked about, one of these little 1 pound cylinders. They're going to collect 1,000 of them and send a bill to Coleman. Is that the
That's
plan?
probably not how they would agree to do it, but it's up to them how to agree to do it.
They don't need to agree to do it, though, do
They
they?
do, if the bill passes.
Sounds like it's going to make an awful lot of bill sending and bill collecting.
That's not how it's happened in the past.
Okay. I'm sure we'll.
Right, yeah, so yeah, there's the, Josh Kelly provided a couple of great handouts that you have one and the others. These are the ones that exist. So you get a sense of how it's been addressed for other toxic solid waste.
Okay. I'm working on it.
Yeah, we all are.
Yeah, thank you.
All right, thank you. All right, next up, we have John Fay joining us via Zoom. He's with the Wyndham Solid Waste Management District. Welcome, Mr. Fay.
Thank you very much. I am here because the director of the Wyndham Solid Waste Management District was going to be away, but he is available. Bob Spencer, could we invite him to please speak?
Sure. Oh, yes, he's in the room as well. All right, we'll switch to Bob Spencer. Welcome, Bob Spencer. His camera's not on yet.
What about Bob?
Are you with us, Mr. Spencer?
There I am.
Okay, great.
That's Bob.
So, yeah, thank you for this opportunity. John has some more specific information to give us. We'll keep this to like 10 or 15 minutes. I want to thank our chair, Sheldon, and also Vice Chair Laura Sibilia, who's from Wilmington and participates in our programs here in Wyndham County. We have 18 towns. We are chartered municipal government, like you've heard from other districts. We have 18 towns, 37,000 persons represented. My board at our meeting last week did review a draft letter, but decided to hold off until we had the opportunity to participate in this session's testimony. But I anticipate the board supporting H67. And that's because, unlike a lot of districts, we do not have our own surcharge fee on per ton of trash. I'm not sure if what other districts do not have that, but our funding literally comes down to grant programs and local tax assessments. And we have a number of select board members that are our board members, and they're very cost conscious, as We all are these days. So concern over the increasing costs is what's driving our participation in this testimony. We also are concerned that we don't have widespread participation as widely as we might have. We have on average about 2 to 3% of eligible households actually participating in any collection. So we look at this as an opportunity to increase our overall participation. When I started at the district 10 years ago, they had been conducting their own collections in what was termed rural rover. And I did one in 2012, and we literally have our staff go out with a flatbed trailer and Gaylord boxes and not a contractor, and collect the materials. We did 2 towns in May of 2012, Brookline and Putney, and I'll never forget driving down Route 5 back to Brattleboro with a flatbed trailer of Gaylord boxes of flammables, corrosives, acids, and just said, this is not the proper way. So the board agreed that we would go to the contractor-based model. And for the last 8 years, that's what we've done. It's just gotten more and more expensive. John has a sheet that, if he could share it, would show these costs over an 11-year period. Can John show a sheet?
Sure. He does have screen share option. Was that submitted? Did you post that? Oh, yeah.
I have posted it. Do you see it there?
Yes, if you could send it to our committee assistant after, so we can have it for our records, that'd be great.
Absolutely.
So John, just hit the highlights here. We have 3 towns, changes in town memberships since 10 years ago. Lost 2 and picked up another one. But anyway, John, do you want to just hit the highlights?
Okay, sure. Thank you. So this shows town by town participation at household hazardous waste events in the Windham Solid Waste District, broken out by town. And at the bottom, you can see the total numbers of participants each calendar year. Early on, when the prices weren't as bad, we had many events. Each green block is an event. And we were upwards of 500 people participating. Costs increased, things changed, and we reduced the number of special events that we had, and the numbers dropped to the 300s or 200s of people participating per year. As and at the bottom, if you see the highlighted numbers here at the bottom are the cost per vehicle or per household attending an event or a drop-off. So it was around $100, and then it started going up and hit a high of $175 in 2019. So in 2020, we put together a plan to reduce our costs by opening a permanent facility at our site. And we did so and opened that in 2021. And you can see when we increase the convenience of having an open, we call it the depot, Household Hazardous Waste Depot, our participation jumped back up into the 300s. And just last year, 353 attendees. So, but meanwhile, the prices dropped from 175, 142, down back to around $100 per household participating in our collections. So what I get out of that is that convenience matters, and having more options for residents to get rid of the hazardous stuff in a proper fashion increases their participation. And that's one thing that we hope that H67 would actually enable, is an increase in convenience by having more locations, open more hours. And that would definitely benefit both the people trying to get rid of that material, as well as the landfill and our environment in general, because it won't be going into trash or being dumped. It will be collected properly. And earlier on, someone had a question, I think it was this morning, about orphan waste. And we estimate that the amount of the material that would come in under H67 purview is probably about 5%, maybe a little more, 8% of the material coming in that would be unlabeled material. The thinner in a peanut butter jar, or the bleach in a milk jug. So it's a very small amount.
Yeah, thank you, John. I'd like to add that another major benefit to communities from having HHW diversion is taking risk away from first responders, particularly fire departments. When we opened our depot in May 21, we had a tour for the Brattleboro Fire Department. They had 3 separate groups come through, and they all expressed their support for trying to get this out of garages and basements and attics and wherever it's stored due to the occupational exposure. So there is another environmental and public health benefit from these programs. So anyway, we are supportive of, at least at the staff level right now, and I anticipate the board being supportive of H67. So I'd be glad to take any questions. As Susan Alexander pointed out this morning from Lamoille Solid Waste, there are additional costs for staff time and overhead and admin than the numbers you're seeing here. We have 4 staff that have trained what's called the 40-hour HAZWOPER, and we do an annual refresher course. We basically have 2 staff people now working 1 day a week to open the depot. It's a half day, but it often takes 6 or 7 hours to put everything away. We also, if you see on the chart John put up, we have been running or participating in at least 1 additional event other than the Brattleboro depot. We had one in Wilmington last summer, which John and I worked, and also Reedsboro. So we're trying to get more opportunities for our public. Also want to acknowledge that we do have A&R funding for the programs through the SWIP grants, and it's around $39,000 a year for our district. And sometimes that does cover the cost and sometimes it doesn't. But I wanted to acknowledge the support we already have from the state. So thank you.
Representative Sibilia.
Yes. Hi, Bob. Thank you for
Sure, Laura.
testifying today. Question about propane canisters. The 20 pound and larger. How many of those do you know how many of those you get in a year that are no longer functional, like the seal or whatever, the valve is not working, that can't be turned in?
John, do you have numbers, or would we have to dig that up from our record?
We would have to dig that up. I would guess it's probably 50 to 70 units a year.
That you can't return.
Correct, that we have to handle here.
How many do you get that you can return? Roughly, say.
None.
Oh, so you're only getting the ones that can't be returned. Got it.
Right,
Okay,
right.
interesting. All
It
right.
can't be refillable.
They can't be refit, well, right, they can be returned. You have to pay to return them and they can't be refilled. That's what I think we heard before.
So
Correct.
I have a follow-up to that. You know, that we took testimony earlier that there was value in that steel. So are you able to recoup any of the cost of accepting them by putting them in a metal collection that you get money for?
Yes, we actually charge users to drop them. And then we devalve them after purging them, and then we can reclaim the scrap value through our scrap metal program.
So would you say you break even on that, or make money or lose money?
Probably about break even, maybe lose a little money. The scrap value is very low, and the staff time in handling the materials is high.
Representative Pat.
Hi, I'm curious, when you switch to the depot system, rather than having, traveling sites, I'll call them, not being that familiar with travel patterns from town to town, is there any noticeable difference in participation from different towns based on it being, very convenient to get to the depot versus out of the way? That just curious.
Definitely. I took some time analyzing that because I had that exact same question. The farther away, the less likely participation is. We do still have a lot of participation from our outlying towns, but not as much as the very close by towns. And that's why you can see, like, for instance, we did one in Wilmington this year because that's one of the farther away towns. So we're going to continue doing the one-day events in the further towns that feel a lack of service because of the distance.
Thank you.
Any further questions for our witnesses from Windham County? I'm not seeing any, but Mr. Kelly, you have your hand up.
I just wanted to kind of piggyback on that comment. Josh Kelly from Solid Waste Program at the State of Vermont. Currently, solid waste districts offer these services, or independent towns or alliances of towns, and they exclude non-residents that aren't paying into their system from other towns. And towns will change districts. When these EPR programs go into place, you can bring it to any event or any collection site, regardless of where you're from. So if you drive from Halifax to Rutland every day for work, you can visit the Rutland place without being closed off. And that is one of the ways in which this issue of town to town, and you're not paying to this town, you get rejected, you get turned away, is kind of broken apart, because anywhere in the state, televisions are collected. It doesn't matter if that's the transfer station you visit every day. If you live in the town of Worcester, you can go, if you drive all the way up to Stowe and go to work, you can go to that place and bring in a television, and it will be taken from you free of charge with these programs. So I just wanted to mention that.
Great, thank you.
This is Bob Spencer again. Following on Josh a bit, we have made arrangements with both the town of Rutland and the city of Keene, New Hampshire, for residents to pay to utilize their facilities. It doesn't get extensive use and it's quite expensive, but Keene will charge, but they won't prohibit someone from out of state. Rutland we have an agreement with the town of Rutland Solid Waste District, the alliance, to take our residents. So I just think what we've been trying to do is expand the availability of these programs. And as our charts show, it is working, but it's still not a significant rate of participation.
Do you happen to know how New Hampshire pays for the disposal of these products?
Well, the city of Keene relies on a contractor, and don't know if they subsidize it or not. Do you, John?
I do not know where the funding comes from.
Yeah.
I
just
suspect
so
it's
you
the
know,
city itself.
One reason our chart shows lower costs the last few years is we did a request for proposals 3 years ago for household hazardous waste services. And we negotiated a very attractive deal with a company called Heritage Environmental Services. They're out of Indiana with office and warehouses in Albany. And we are anticipating a significant increase once that contract expires. But we're right now paying relatively lower rates for setup and collection and disposal than some of the other districts that you've heard from.
When does your contract expire?
Is it 3 years, John?
Well, we've had 2 extensions, so it does expire this coming spring.
Right. So.
All right, thank you again for your testimony. Members have any final questions? Not seeing any. All right, thank you.
Well, thank you, folks.
Thank you very much for the opportunity.
Our next witness is Bill Driscoll. Welcome, Mr. Driscoll.
There's subtle psychological implications of how you set up the witness table.
No, I think you know we're just pinched for space.
Yes, I know. At least you have these windows, so glad you guys kept the committee room. Thanks. I appreciate the opportunity to be here. For the record, Bill Driscoll, I'm Vice President of Associated Industries of Vermont. Represent primarily the manufacturing sector in the state. So what I'd like to do is just sort of address some questions, issues, or concerns surrounding this bill that we would encourage the committee to work through. And then we have sort of a more general process recommendation at the end as well. And I'll be following up in writing as well, especially if there are questions or things that I can come back to you about. Starting out, I think as you've heard a little bit with Mr. O'Grady and others, this is a fairly ambitious proposal. It's not the most ambitious EPR bill that you're likely going to see, but it is fairly broad in scope. It's not something that other states have done. It's not entirely the same approach that some Canadian provinces have taken, and that raises some inherent questions or issues. Sometimes nobody else does something because there just hasn't been somebody to do it first, and sometimes it's because there are significant challenges or problems with a particular proposal. So there's definitely things I think that ought to be sort of worked through here or thought about, and those tend to be addressing things like scope, cost, and accountability, some other design elements of the bill, at least as introduced. And with scope, I think coming back to, as you've heard questions raised or thought about too, is getting a much better idea, a concrete idea of exactly what products are going to be covered. And the reason why that's important, it's difficult now. Obviously, there's been some analyses done by the Product Stewardship Council looking at waste characterization. There's been lists of what sort of broad categories solid waste districts consider to be household hazardous waste. But that's not necessarily the same thing as looking at the definition as it is in this bill and understanding how that's actually going to be realized in the real world. There's a couple of reasons why it's important to have that clear understanding. One is, I think it's very likely that if we get down to brass tacks, there'll be a number of products that would not really seem to make sense to include in this bill. I think it's just fair speculation that citronella candles and flea collars are not the only things that could possibly be included that maybe don't necessarily make sense to do so. So having a clearer idea of the appropriateness of what's ultimately the list of covered products is important to understand. And that also gives us sort of a common frame of reference to then debate, the pros and cons of other elements of it. It is also important to have a fuller understanding of exactly what's covered, to really look at the sort of diversity or the makeup of the manufacturing market or stakeholders, because you may find that there are categories being lumped together in basically a common stewardship program that maybe not doesn't make entire sense. It might make sense to pursue product lines more discreetly. That's really sort of a thing that that industry has to kind of struggle with. You could be setting up challenges and trying to allocate costs within stewardship organizations or responsibilities that could really raise some serious questions of equity and fairness. And you could be setting up a real administrative challenge. And that's just something that I think should be considered and maybe factored into exactly how you proceed with this idea. And frankly, I was hoping to kind of catch the A&R folks here today, Madam Chair, because bringing up.
Still with us.
Oh, all right, good. I was looking for Matt. That's why I'll be happy to talk to him about it, because bringing up the whole PFAS question, and which also obviously raises other chemical ingredients, understanding exactly how that would factor into this, that could also just raise a whole other area of a great deal of complications. So I'm hoping to get a better understanding from A&R about what exactly that means and how that could play into this before I could, argue that how it factors into the debate about this bill.
Are you? I'm trying to let you finish the scope part of and then we might have some questions. So I don't want.
So that is the scope part. I think I've hit the reasons why it's important to get an idea of the scope.
So I have a question. We were given a list. It seems pretty clear to me. How would you recommend getting a clearer idea that would be more clear than what we have?
So I think I think the most direct way is to sit down with A&R and ask them how they translate this reference to the hazardous waste regulations, translate that into a list of products. And then, good, better, or different, we'll have that in front of us and be able to react to it.
Right. Representative Stebbins.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Hi. My question is, so you mentioned that you would be concerned about, equity and fairness in terms of costs for the program. And I guess, the whole concept of this is to not overly regulate businesses, but to say, hey, businesses, you guys come together and you guys figure out your plan. So to me, that is what I've heard businesses say they appreciate. When government doesn't tell them what to do, but rather when they can work together to come up with what makes the most sense for them. Do you not read the bill that way? Or do you think that it's, like Sherwin-Williams is going to outcompete Turtle Wax or?
Right. No, and I appreciate the take on it you're presenting. My take on it, that is, again, it's a concern. It doesn't guarantee that's not going to work or that these folks can't figure it out. But I think even if you leave it to them to figure it out on their own, if you are setting them up so that you're going to have manufacturers of very low impact, maybe very often fully consumed products, as opposed to products that are the ones that create the greatest concerns for the solid waste districts, and they have to be in there, and everybody has to pay something. I think if you're setting up a very diverse and mixed group of varying exposure, I guess, or engagement, I think, and they have to figure out how to charge each other money. I think it's just setting up a potentially complicated or fractious discussion. Whether it turns out that way or not, it depends. But I think the more homogeneous or discrete a program is, putting aside the pros and cons, otherwise, the easier it is to figure out how to administer it. And that's one of the things about this particular topic. A lot of the EPR programs that we have, even e-waste, although that might be the most analogous one, they're still relatively coherent homogeneous product lines. And I think that just promotes administrative equity and smoothness, if you will, as opposed to lumping together a really wide variety of very disparate products and companies.
So just to follow up, are you suggesting that we would have individual EPRs for individual sort of types of projects? Like
it depends. I think what makes sense. I think in part it makes sense what makes sense for industry, but in order to come to that conclusion, it's better to have a more concrete list, so we really can see the diversity of products and we can have a better idea of whether industry thinks that they could, these folks could work together, or this kind of take back would make more sense for this product or that. The way things are, to jump ahead a little bit, I think the way that the bill is introduced, it really makes it almost impossible as a practical matter that there will be multiple programs. And so potential challenges in trying to administer a global program for these products, those are just the kind of potential problems or issues that you at least need to be more transparent in terms of understanding what we're getting into with the products covered, and then thinking through, what are the administrative consequences or opportunities of that.
Thank you. New committee, new subject area. Good question in my mind about how do we determine what's on the list, what's projects are hazardous or not. So I'm looking for a definition. I think, I'm not sure that I see the statute definition, but I think there is a statute definition. There's an answer on the program. It's not in our bill, but I think it's in statute.
It is in statute.
Yeah, there are criteria involved, and I think a lot of it is how the secretary applies those criteria to a given product or substance. In other words, I don't think, and not to at the risk of not fully understand, I don't think there's like an existing list of products that we can easily now point to that this is what this bill means. There are criteria, but having criteria is not the same thing as having a list. You really have to translate that more into the real world.
So how would we get to a list from the criteria?
I think that's, and I'm sure they would love to do it. But I think it'd be, as a straightforward practical matter, if this bill passes, the agency is going to have to do that work. So even if it's not a final finished product, because I know you guys love taking on extra work, but I think there most should be doable to try to get a more concrete idea.
Sort of begs the question of, has that been done? And I would ask does either of the two previous witnesses in the room have an answer to that question?
And Holiday from the Chittenden Solid Waste District, that the definition in the bill refers to statutory definitions of what constitute a hazardous waste, right? So manufacturers are very much aware what their product is in the scope of the world of hazardous products. They know that their product would be captured under this law or not, based on whether it's a hazardous waste once it becomes a waste.
Sure. Yes. So what would be really helpful for me is if someone has a statutory reference.
It's right here, 7-702.
Okay, 7-702.
So every day, probably there's a new product coming out. Fit the scope. Moving target.
But I think that I don't think it's quite as, that's the starting point. I don't know if it's really quite as simple as that. I think there is some judgment and determination that needs to take place, and that probably would take place. And even so, even if we could produce the list right now, which would be great, I think it would be important to actually go through that and really see again the example of what's already in the bill. Citronella candles and flea collars are out. Okay. there good reason for that? And then if there's good reason for those products, I think it's fair to suspect that there might be some other products that would be covered in the bill as it is introduced, and whether that's really the right thing or what the thing that you guys want to do. And then, how workable or practical or appropriate is that list going forward as the foundation for how this might be designed.
So
Do something.
So,
You're thinking.
excuse me, sorry.
Are you-
Chair.
are you-
Yes, yes,
Okay.
yes. So, I'm just looking for ways to, make this more fair or palatable. So what I think I'm hearing you say is there are criteria, and I still haven't found the statute, but I will. And then I think what I'm hearing Jen say is manufacturers know what is hazardous. There's a list. So if there's some subjectiveness, if there's a new product that's coming out, and so we have a definition and a criteria have to be applied to determine if it's hazardous or not. So your concern then, Mr. Driscoll, is on the process by which that determination is made?
So what we would like to see, and what I would hope that everyone would like to see is what is that list? And then looking at that list, what are some of the implications or the suggestions that might flow from that? For example, other things that as written are going to be captured by this bill that maybe don't make sense to include, or that there might be some reason not to include them. We don't really know. It's hard to say that until we have the list. Number one. Number two, again, once we have a real concrete idea, it's easier to judge whether there should be more opportunity, for example, for discrete programs, which again is we don't really have now. As a practical matter, I'm concerned that this bill does not really lead that way, or make it practical for that to be the case. So it's just better to know. And I think that's also gives industry an idea of what are going to be the organizational challenges if they have to do this. And again, so it's hard to do that when you don't have a more concrete understanding of what's going to be included. And I would say, to be fair, getting to Jen's point, I think that coming up with that list would probably, it's not a one-sided process for A&R. I'm sure there would be it would be helpful to have some communication between the agency and the manufacturers, because again, they may it's a cooperative. There's probably a really good term for it. I can't think of it right now.
Representative Sibilia.
So I'm trying to understand the nature of the problem that we need to solve here. And so I think maybe now what I'm hearing is, or what I'm understanding, now what I'm hearing, I think you're saying the same thing, I'm understanding differently, is that you want to see a list from the criteria. So this list that is here is not inclusive.
I think it's
suggestive.
I think it's presumable that's not necessarily precisely what it would be. And also those, if I recall correctly, I don't have that in front of me, but those are also just categories and ingredients, right? So
yeah, they're not brand, they're not so you want an exhaustive list of all the products
I don't
considered?
think it has to be exhaustive down to every single brand name and stuff like that. I think, confirming how that list there would correspond to what the bill actually covers as drafted. Maybe if there are areas that seem vague, to kind of drill down a little bit. That's what I'm talking. So, and in that case, this may or may not be a difficult thing to do, but I don't feel that we have a list that we're confident that this is actually what the bill covers.
And so that list would be helpful in terms of the formation of the PR group.
So I see at least two uses or needs for that list. The first being there's very strong possibility that there could be additional products that should be excluded for any number of reasons, because they're not really all that impactful, or there's
Included or excluded?
excluded.
Okay.
Because you wouldn't be able to, well, anyway. You don't know what you don't know, right? So the list would probably more identify things that don't need to be in the bill, as opposed to stuff that needs to go in. So that's one question or issue that should be addressed, and you have to have a list to address it. The other one would be the organizational implications.
What does that mean?
To have a better sense or appreciation of what industry, what manufacturers are either going to require to somehow mesh together, or is it going to appear that we should allow more flexibility for more discrete or subset groups to work on a more homogeneous, product area? And again, that may or may not be how they best work it out, but before a bill goes into effect and then we find out that there are these problems potentially or not, it's better to go in with our eyes open.
So it's my understanding, Madam Chair, there are 4 EPRs already in the 6 or 5.
5 or 6 if you count the bottom.
Okay, so do you know if this problem has been tackled in those EPRs where we've had someone that wasn't on the original list and then came onto the list, and how that's kind of?
Yeah, I think.
Do you know how that's been navigated? And then I would love it if we could ask.
I think the best analog to this would probably be e-waste in terms of having some fairly diverse products, but I don't know as a practical term if it actually is all that diverse. And I know that there have been issues with the e-waste program in terms of costs and other things like that. Most of the other programs are very discrete product lines. You don't have that kind of diversity that you do have with this particular proposal. And there are also other design elements that are different in those programs than this, and there are issues surrounding that. But the homogeneity of the covered products, there's a big difference between most of the existing programs we have and this, just on a level of scale.
Okay, so hazardous waste is actually a much broader category than battery.
Right.
Okay.
How many manufacturers are in Vermont who manufacture products that would be considered household hazardous waste?
Well, that's a good question. I think if I had that list, I would be able to give you a better answer. I don't think it's a huge number, but there certainly are some.
And yeah. And so we've taken a lot of testimony today on the costs that are increasing pretty rapidly for taxpayers, essentially, of disposing of these. And I guess I'm curious, how would you solve this problem?
Well, I think that's a good question. I guess the starting point, and I want to be clear, I think a lot of whether or not or how manufacturers contribute to the costs. I think the devil's in the details in terms of is it a fair and rational system? Is it cost effective and efficient? But I think those are conclusions I don't think we're at yet. But as a general point, I think one would start with what is failing, or what has been demonstrated not to work, or is assumed it will not work with the existing funding mechanisms. And this gets a little bit to what's really happening with the costs on a proposal like this. Broadly speaking, you're not necessarily reducing the cost of managing this waste. If anything, you're probably making it more expensive. The theory for some advocates of this kind of approach is obviously, well, let's just throw that cost on out-of-state manufacturers and not on Vermonters, and that solves an issue. There are a number of different ways to critique that, but I think at the end of the day, the cost is going to come back around probably one way or another in terms of the cost of the product or whatnot. And people may argue, well, we're just Vermont. They're not going to bother trying to pass costs back to Vermont. Maybe not. I think that there are a number of challenges to doing that. But also, I think presumably, if folks want to adopt this here, presumably they want it adopted in every state. I mean, I would assume that that's probably the hope and intent. And once that happens, then absolutely, the cost will come back to consumers. So it's not really reducing the cost. It's not necessarily or indefinitely shielding the costs from Vermonters. So the question really comes down to how can we most cost effectively manage the waste? And other questions that come into how you finance that, and this is one of the other issues with sort of EPR in general, there's different approaches. But I think there's arguments to be made that applying that cost as directly and transparently to the consumer is the best way for a number of reasons. One, when you actually have skin in the game, as it were, or you have that sort of visceral connection to the program, I would argue that increases the desire to participate. If you look at the paint program, it's actually a good example of where you have an upfront cost the consumer knows about, and they're paying for that. I think their desire to get their money's worth and actually use the program that they're already paying for is a contributing factor to the success of that program. Not the only thing, it's not a magic wand, but I think, there's that. And then you could look at other issues, like say it's applied at the very beginning of the manufacturing process. Manufacturers can't, there's great limits on how that can just simply be absorbed or disappear. It's likely that's going to go into the cost of the product. And if you introduce a cost at the manufacturing level, and that stays with that product through the supply chain and the markup points, that increased cost at the manufacturer level will be magnified at the consumer end in terms of prices, because it's gone through that markup process, as opposed to being applied directly at the end of the line where you don't have that sort of inflationary effect. Now, obviously, this is all kind of, theoretical, and, so this is how I would see it. Hopefully that would make some sense to folks, but so there's a lot of implications about how you apply the cost. There's incentive issues with the consumer, because ultimately all of this depends on the consumer doing what you want them to do. And then there's more expensive or less expensive total end results.
Yeah. Representative Stebbins.
Thanks, Madam Chair. So I would argue that right now that's the program we have, where we are applying the cost to the consumer.
Mhm.
We have municipal taxes or state taxes that then the state pays through SWIP to help municipalities.
Mhm.
We've heard testimony that because of external pressures in terms of costs, the costs are going up, including things like the handlers and the contractors are merging, and it's now a national company, and there isn't as much ability for, price negotiation. So costs are going up. So is it AIV's recommendation to increase taxes on the taxpayers? And then my follow-up question is, we heard testimony earlier this morning that there have been studies done that when you do increase the cost to getting rid of your trash, people just dump the hazardous waste, which ultimately, if it gets in our drinking water or whatever, just costs society more. They either dump it in our, in their normal trash, or like in a river. We did not hear that testimony that it was in a river, but having worked in rivers, I can say it's a really great dumping spot. Not that I recommend it, but there's a lot of dumping going on, or historically. So sort of a two-part question, like, is that the recommendation, that we should just pass those costs, we should increase them to the taxpayers? And then I guess your comment back, what your reflection is, if the studies say that all that does is make the waste actually end up impacting society more because it's not disposed of properly.
I mean, I think it's a fair question or factor to kind of balance in there. I think, to the extent that policy decisions of how we want to handle waste and the fees or taxes are directly tied to doing that as as cost effectively and efficiently as possible, then one element of that is it costs what it costs. Right. So there's that kind of advocating toward just setting the existing funding mechanisms to the appropriate level to do what needs to be done. But I'm also not saying that there's definitely no role to be played by the manufacturers either. It's just a question: is this the best or most appropriate way to involve them? And that's something which I'm hoping that industry and ANR and other stakeholders can actually try to really kind of noodle through and try to figure out, if there's a way to find some sort of middle ground on stuff. And there may be other mechanisms to fund or supplement, because it's probably not going to only be one funding source to supplement the cost of this. Maybe something similar to the paint program or something like that. I don't have a conclusive answer, but I think there's a lot of possibilities out there to kind of think through.
Thanks.
Mm-hmm.
Representative Morris.
Thanks, Madam Chair, and thanks, Bill, for that concept.
Mm-hmm.
However, I live in a border community with New Hampshire. So if we were to increase cost to the
Mm-hmm.
Vermont consumer for some of these products that are hazardous,
Mm-hmm.
it's like our gas tax. I talk to a lot of people every day, that, not myself included, but they go to New Hampshire to get their gasoline. So Vermont loses out on, number one, the revenue for that tax, and number two, they're in a sense not paying for our roads through the gas tax. They do through property taxes and et cetera, and state tax. But, so I'm wondering your thoughts on that. If we were, I think the paint is a national.
No,
that's just Vermont.
Mm-hmm. Well, okay. I think there are some other states that have done it, but I don't believe any of our border states have it.
Okay.
Yeah.
So I'm bordering communities have, I think, a different animal than maybe the central part of the state. Then people aren't going to drive from Montpelier over to Littleton, New Hampshire, or Lebanon or whatever to buy some pesticide. I have a lot of people that constituents that buy their groceries in New Hampshire. So that, without going to an extended provider responsibility, we're not going to shield us from that. That's just going to be a natural migration.
Well, I think the thing is it transparent or is it not transparent? Because obviously, if in theory, obviously, or eventually, if we get to a place where these costs are really being flowed back entirely through prices, it also begs the question of if it is widely adopted, it'll still increase the cost. It'll still cost everybody, but there may or may not be as much of that state diversion in terms of where you shop. But getting back to there are a lot of different ways to kind of look at this, or pieces to kind of fit together. I think certainly if a customer charge, a product charge, kind of like what paint has, if that were used, or even if it was part of the mix, you would obviously have to be sensitive and think about whether that would, how much would that exacerbate the cross-border issues for sales. I think the hope is that with the paint program, for example, it's not significant enough to be a huge driver there, but it's definitely, you could ask Aaron Segrist again. I'm sure, it's definitely a concern. Every little bit adds up. So yeah, that's a legitimate mitigating factor or thing to keep in mind if one were to go down that road. For sure.
Thank you.
Representative Clifford.
Chair, thank you, Madam Chair. I apologize for not being here at the beginning of Mr. Driscoll's testimony. Do you see any kind of risk that this law is passed, that manufacturers would actually pull stuff off the shelves or not distribute to distributors?
It would really depend on how onerous and costly it would end up being. I don't know that this bill, as it's currently, where that tipping point would be with regard to this bill as it is now, but that's the kind of potential. And again, I think that also gets back to it'd be important to really have an idea of, who's covered and what is this going to mean for them. So in principle, that's always a risk, and it comes down to how onerous and how expensive is any given proposal going to be. I'll give you an actual tipping point for generally, or certainly not for like specific companies, but obviously things like that have happened. It's not a completely outlandish possibility.
Thank you.
When have things like that happened?
Well, I think the example of the GMO labeling thing was one recent example in Vermont history where there was a
week that ended up resulting in a national change, but yeah.
But you know, again, there was a tipping point obviously for those folks when it came to Vermont, and I mean, obviously, one would hope that the reason why we don't see a lot of that all the time is because legislators don't necessarily, pass stuff that that has that strong of an impact on folks.
So I guess you keep kind of questioning the structure, but the structure is intended to be worked out among the manufacturers, and that they would actually be responsible for figuring out a fair system amongst themselves based on whatever metric they chose.
But the legislation is laying out parameters for that self-organization. I mean, the legislation is going to tell you who's in. The legislation is going to tell you what kind of things do you have to do. So it's not like asking industry, which wouldn't be a bad idea. Actually, strongly recommend it if you're open to do it. Saying to industry, how would you design a program to address some of these concerns? And really have that sort of freedom. I mean, the paint program was a largely industry developed program. And I think it has a lot of authority. We don't generally support EPR as a general concept, but it really comes down to the details of how there's actually designed. And I think the paint program has a lot of positive design elements. I don't know how applicable it would be to this broad swath of products, but I only say that to say that it's not like programs along these lines can't be developed.
So a couple just follow-ups. I thought I heard you saying you just now we were saying that legislation does prescribe who's in, but you've been saying it doesn't. Do you support the legislation being more clear about who's in up front?
The legislation determines who's in because there is a definition of a covered product. The problem is that we don't know we don't today know what that list is.
So you want the list before we pass the legislation?
Oh, yes. I think what's on the list will speak to whether, again, like I was saying at the beginning, it could speak to whether that list should be curtailed or changed, or scope should be changed perhaps for some products. And also it would make it easier to judge how much flexibility or some other design elements of how best and most efficiently to have all those products included and sort of trying to move in the same direction as this. Because I think some of the issues, and I don't know, I mean, this is my last gig for the day, so I can stay as long. I don't know if you want me to sort of go through the rest of my testimony, or if you want to.
Oh, absolutely.
About this stuff.
We've digressed so far.
Well, I don't mind digression.
So before I do that,
your time. So
you just made a suggestion inviting industry in. Who would we invite?
So I'm confident you're going to hear from the main players. I hesitate to name them because I don't want to put them on the hook to definitely decide to come in, but I strongly expect that there's could be that the major industry groups, as Michael Grady would say, it's not like they don't, they are aware of this and have been thinking it through. So I think you'll be hearing from them directly.
Okay.
So, Madam Chair,
yes.
Can I ask a question?
Yes.
So if we wanted to plan to have testimony because we're moving the bill, could you get us a list?
I can absolutely ask them, and if they want to be on, if they want to pass on their name, or if they want to get in touch with you directly. And I think I can guarantee you that I will be having that conversation with them.
So I mean, I don't want to put words in your mouth, Madam Chair, but I was thinking you were asking, should we hear other people?
And who?
Yes.
Okay. Yes, that's what I was asking.
Okay.
Okay. Yes, please finish your testimony.
Okay. So just some of the specific elements of the bill. I think one of the big concerns is the way the compensation for existing providers is set up. It would appear the way I read it, and maybe there are other aspects, and maybe the agency might have some thoughts on this, but it kind of appears that there really isn't any oversight or accountability for the costs that the solid waste districts could incur, and then the stewardship organization would just have to pay. I'm not trying to be pejorative in the sense that it's kind of like a blank check kind of setup. And I think from a fairness and sort of cost effectiveness angle, I think that raises concerns when there's really no disincentive to spending. It's a question of whether it's new facilities or staff or programs are the solid waste districts going to be making. And I'm not trying to.
Can I just interrupt you for 1 second? Are you speaking to a particular section of the bill?
I am, but I don't have it in front of me. But it's basically there's a requirement on the stewardship organizations to pay all costs associated. So the question is, though, is there any ability for, especially the folks that are paying, to have any sort of oversight or control on making sure that what they're being charged for is as cost effective and responsible as possible? I also have to imagine that there could be potential problems with multiple use facility and multiple responsibility personnel. In other words, are we going to be charged, when I say our manufacturers are going to be charged for the salaries of somebody who works on hazardous waste sometimes, but also does a lot of other things? Or are they going to be charged for facilities that are constructed that handle hazardous waste, but also other waste streams? How is that going to be sort of overseen and managed? I'm not saying that it can't be done, but it does not appear to be, the bill doesn't appear to provide for that kind of oversight and control in terms of who incurs the costs and who has to pay them.
Not sure I follow the multiple use facilities. You're saying because they have a whole transfer station, you're not sure what portion.
So say a solid waste district builds a new facility to handle that. The facility handles hazardous waste, but also other waste streams, right? So how is there going to be a control to make sure that those costs are parsed out or calculated so that the stewardship organization isn't simply paying for the whole building, even though the whole building is not dealing with hazardous waste? It's not technically what they should be responsible for under the logic of it.
Yeah, that's what I thought you said.
And same thing for personnel. People may, I don't know what the staff makeup and responsibilities are for all the solid waste districts, but I have to imagine there's probably a lot of people who do multiple things, working on hazardous waste and also doing other work as well. So how do you oversee and make sure that that's being accounted for properly in the way that this is set up?
Any other?
We've had a little bit of talk, I think, about consumer incentives and how the costs are designed. I am concerned that this will be a more expensive system as currently set up, in part because of concerns about those sort of cost controls we were just talking about, and imposing costs at the manufacturing point of consumer pricing. So there's just general concern. We've kind of already talked about that. I think the other structural thing, and again, it may not be that every product wants to have their own collection point or a collection line. We don't know how broadly or how comprehensively some of them might be designed, but I think it's entirely conceivable that there may be products that make sense to handle separately or in some other sort of special way. But I think that the way the bill sort of sets up the stewardship organizations, it would seem that's kind of designed to basically force everybody into just one. And why is that? That's because every organization has to accept every kind of waste. So that kind of mitigates against that, kind of undermines specialization, where it might make sense. The performance goals are global performance goals as far as I can see. So you have to accept in the existing solid waste districts your programs and all the whatever diversity they're bringing to it. So it seems like it's not something that's set up for alternative approaches or more discrete approaches, if those were to make sense for the given product. So anyway, that's a concern there. The performance goals themselves, I know it was kind of an interesting conversation when O'Grady was going through it with you. It is kind of an odd, it just seems like potentially problematic where you have, again, a lot of these products, arguably most of these products, I don't know what the actual percentage is, but a significant portion of these products are ones that are used up and then the containers are disposed of through recycling or other things like that. And that just doesn't strike that, there's going to be the frequency of needing to dispose of these wastes where picking 5% household participation every year, and it kind of seems like it's written so that it kind of ratchets up. I just don't know if that's really reflects what is needed or what's realistic. I can't really say much more than that. Just it seems like that might not really reflect how real world will operate in terms of how people would take advantage of these programs. And the only other thing, again, this is not for or against anything because we have significant concerns with the packaging EPR proposals that have been put forward. If anything, a lot of the concerns with this one are even bigger with that. But as is a sort of a coherence issue, there's definitely seem to be possibilities for these two, for a packaging EPR program and this program to overlap significantly in terms of covered products, which you can handle that in multiple different ways, but it would seem to be a potential complication in terms of, where do you really want these products to be handled? Are you going to be setting up a situation where basically you're being double hit for whoever's paying the cost for it? It's neither here nor there in terms of, do you look at this first? Do you look at packaging first? Do you do both? Do you do neither? It's more a question. It just seems like that should be a conversation. Are you going to pursue this bill just as it is, and then if it gets enacted, and then if you take up packaging EPR, are you going to adjust that around this bill post passage if it does pass, or are you going to try to look ahead and anticipate how the two issues mesh together? It seemed like something worth sort of thinking through and talking about. Not that we're a fan of either one, but just seems something to do.
I have another question too about you. So this topic's come up maybe since I've been elected.
Mm-hmm.
And I guess I'm just curious what solutions or how you've participated in the conversations or how you've been involved trying to help it, or what feels like, I guess I'm looking for alternatives. If you're not supportive of this, I need to know what your creative ideas are.
Yeah, and I think it's really more for the industry groups that are more focused. And it's my understanding that they have been thinking hard about this, which is why my last recommendation is really to, again, I'm assuming that they're going to get in touch with you folks, and if they don't, I will be working to make sure that they do. But I think I believe that there's real opportunity if the industry groups who are most directly affected can sit down and talk through this with the agency and other stakeholders, that they could very well have alternative recommendations on this.
Because I thought they had been involved in this, but we'll follow up on that. Representative Sibiala.
Well, that's my second question, which is, I think, hasn't this bill gotten passed a bunch of times before? So, okay. And did that happen? That was not my primary question.
Better get to your primary.
Okay, my
question,
primary
because we're
question, because we have to go to the floor, is I'm hearing you on the wanting to be sure that the group is not being charged for other collection activity.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And I'm just looking through here at the plan requirements, and then the agency responsibilities.
Mhm.
I would be interested in understanding if you had language suggestions there to help make that a little clearer.
Mhm.
So I don't know if you do.
I mean, not.
Yeah.
Not really, but that I'm sure if we continue to go down this road, I'm sure we'll have recommendations for that.
That'd be great too. Yeah. Representative Stebbins.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And just if you happen to be able to provide us with a list of your members that would be directly impacted by this, that would be great.
Yeah, well, I mean, we will certainly be working to identify not just our members, but the companies of Vermont that would be impacted by it.
Because I mean, a similar bill did pass last year, so I guess I think you might have that available.
I think we worked on it, but then, things moved fairly quickly last year. And so at some point, just, the bill stalling in the Senate, I don't think we had the need to sort of complete that list. But I am going to be working much more intensively on it.
Great.
So.
All right. Thank you for your testimony.
Sure.
Thank you.
Right, members, we need to go to the floor. We also need to wrap up our budget adjustment conversations. I'm going to ask members who could be, we need to reconvene after the floor. I understand some people are driving home. And so I want to get a sense of how many members can stay after 2, 3.
Buying one.
Be quick.
Do you have a time frame?
Be relatively quick, and Kate's already at home, so she can join. Nice to see you, Representative Lowe.
Come back after the floor on that?
Yes.
Yeah, come back here after
Okay.
the floor.
Do you anticipate 15 minutes, half an hour? Or?
Yes, 15 minutes or half an hour.
Okay, really,
Yeah.
So, all right.
There is, there is a letter.
No agenda.
Commissioner Burling sent a letter,
Plus the
4-page letter about.
Okay, great. We'll talk. We can. All right, folks. So we're gonna take a break for the floor and reconvene after.